Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this Mindwise debate. We're really excited to have you join us. My name is Valeria Cernei. I'm a science communication.
Hold on, Valeria Cernei. Let me swap microphones with you. I think the sound.
Work?
I didn't like the sound.
Is this better? Okay. So my name is Valeria Cernei. I'm a science communicator, and I'm co-hosting tonight's event together with Tassos Sarampalis, who is a teacher and also a science communication enthusiast. And we're both here because we're interested in creating spaces for risky dialogue on topics that are important to all of us. And tonight's topic is no exception, as we'll be talking about truth. What is it, and can there be more than one?
Indeed. All right, let me take this microphone. Thank you, Valeria, for introducing this. Indeed, this tonight's debate is organized in the context of a much larger conference that is happening in Groningen at the end of the week. It's a conference organized by the Research School of Behavioral and Cognitive Neurosciences, BCN, and it's called Nothing But the Truth. And over the course of 2 full days, scholars from all over the world and also from Groningen will explore various ideas about what truth is and how we share this truth with one another within academia, across fields in academia, but also between society, policymakers, science, and all kinds of other fields. Tonight's debate will deal with the fundamental matters about the nature of knowledge, what it is, how it functions in society, and indeed about the role or the importance and implications of things like objectivity and relativism in these matters. And as Valeria said, we create these debates because we want to foster an environment, or we want to create an environment in which we can respectfully, but with passion, argue about ideas that are important to us as academics, but also about matters that are important in society at large. The concepts of truth have been in the media and in conversations for a while now, in very heated conversations. So it's one more reason for us today to call for an atmosphere of respect when we talk about these things later on during the discussion.
So we have a formal debate to start off the evening. This means that we have 2 teams, and they will have a debate according to the Karl Popper debating format. They will argue over one proposition, which is knowledge is political. So we have one team arguing for this proposition, one team arguing against this proposition. And this formal part of the event is supposed to be black and white and not very nuanced, because we want to outline the arguments for and against this proposition. And then, therefore, the arguments that you'll hear from both of the teams will not necessarily be aligned with the speaker's professional or personal stance on the subject, because we ask them to really stick to the position of their team on the matter. But this also means that after the formal part is over, we'll have a more nuanced conversation and we'll go a bit more in depth into the arguments that were brought up. So we'll start with the formal part of the debate, and then we'll continue with an audience discussion that will last about 30 minutes, and we'll be able to bring up more nuance to this topic. And Tassos will now introduce you to the speakers that will be debating tonight.
There are two teams, as Valeria has indicated. One team is for the proposition and is on your left, or as they like to think, they're on the right. They're both on the right, you'll see, depending on what perspective you'll be sitting. So for the proposition, we have Wally van der Laan, who is a student assessor of the Faculty of Philosophy and is currently studying medicine, philosophy, political science, and economics. Wally is involved in various research projects concerning pediatric oncology, medical education, and bioethics. Next to him is Carmen van Bruggen. She is a PhD student in spatial sciences, researching the topic of community building by the use of participatory art and cultural projects. And with them in their team is Mohamed Garesifard, and is an assistant professor at the Center for Learning and Teaching at the Faculty of Science and Engineering. He has a background spanning civil engineering, water resources management, and social sciences. He specializes in the theory and application of citizen science and public participation processes in the fields of sustainability and environmental governance. On my left, on your right, and whatever perspective you have in that sense, is the team against the proposition that knowledge is political. And they are Leah Henderson, who is professor of philosophy of science and epistemology, holding an endowed chair in societal trust from the Royal Holland Society of Sciences and Humanities and the Agricola School of the University of Groningen. Thomas Wildschut, who is a PhD student in experimental psychology, working on cognitive models that aim to capture how human learners retain and forget information over time. He is interested in philosophy of cognitive science and the communication of science to the general public. And Ansgar Heinrich is an associate professor of journalism, studies and media, with an interest in alternative journalism, social media, and crisis reporting in the digital age. She leads the research project Who's Breaking the News? Global Conflict Reporting in the Digital Age, where she explores today's complex digital information networks. So with this, please join me in welcoming the six speakers who will be here debating this idea that knowledge is political.
And now that we got the applause out of the way, I'd like to ask you to reserve your applause until the formal debate is over, so that we can keep it flowing. And we'll also be keeping time during the formal part of the debate, so you'll see me waving some cards for the speakers so they know when their time is up. And as I said, the black card means that you have 1 minute left, and the pink card means that the time is over. And with this, let's start the debate.
Very good. So we begin with Wally van der Laan, who is going to give the opening speech for the team on the affirmative side of the debate.
Yes. All right, thank you. Dear audience, tonight's thesis statement is on the question whether knowledge is political. And as the first speaker of tonight, it's my honor to define the terms that are at stake here, knowledge and political. When we claim that knowledge is political, we define knowledge as a justified true belief. It might be familiar to you if you study philosophy, for example. It is something that you, first of all, believe to be the case, so you have a conviction. It is something that's actually the case, so it's true. And thirdly, there's a justification for it, so there's a reason as to why this is true and why you therefore should believe it. And additionally, our definition of political is also rather specific. So political is that which is determined by the struggle between the interests of groups of people. And this gets me to the main thesis that our team wishes to defend tonight, which is that knowledge is political. Because we often think of science as something that's value neutral. You generate a hypothesis based on pre-existing literature, you crunch some numbers, and you formulate a conclusion. All these steps, however, are political in nature. Political as we define it, I should say, does not mean parliamentary. So it doesn't refer to a political process like the process of making laws, for example, or that it's something that's determined by government necessarily. Rather, it is our own biases and our desires for power one way or another that result in this struggle. And scientific knowledge is deeply related to the power dynamics present in any field imaginable. And I will give 3 main examples of this. So generally speaking, our research depends on political actors in one way or another. How we get our funding, how we decide on our research topic, and how we interpret our data are all the result of our biases and the lenses that we have, as well as competing interests. We've only recently been, relieved of the COVID-19 pandemic, a period filled with mixed scientific evidence, the silencing of doctors and scientists alike, who first announced the existence of the virus and an upsurge in fake news and propaganda. And it seems clear to us that whoever wins this struggle of interests is the one who determines what knowledge is prioritized or dismissed. It is not the silenced scientist that determines who knowledge is. It is rather the politician or the entrepreneur that was able to silence her. Scientific endeavor is therefore clearly manipulable by political censorship. Besides this, there's great incentive for people to pretend to generate scientific knowledge so as to preserve their position of power. For example, when El País, a Spanish newspaper, exposed the grave misconduct happening at several Saudi Arabian universities earlier this year, it turned out that when you pay a group of scientists to claim your country's top universities as their affiliated research center, that your university will end up in international top lists. Just like our university is a top university, so are universities that pay researchers for fake references, fake affiliation, and other forms of scientific misconduct. The overt goal is, of course, to show the world how productive they are in producing scientific knowledge, but its covert goal, its secret goal, or a hidden goal, is to maintain its power and strategic position in the world, which is intrinsically political. Finally, take the case of scientists actually producing what we would call knowledge that was neglected, overseen, or ignored. Rosalind Franklin, for example, was a chemist interested in DNA, or at least she did pioneering work in what we call DNA today. Without her research, many of the innovations in science and medicine that we have now wouldn't exist, or would have perhaps existed far later or in a different way. Unfortunately for Franklin, however, it was not that she produced poor science. She was simply of the wrong gender. Her contributions were neglected and particularly overshadowed by her male colleagues and their work, irrespective of scientific merit or quality. And women are not the only people who sustain such examples of injustice. Think of scientists of color like Katherine Johnson, whose work in mathematics was pivotal to the NASA space program. Her name is not remembered as much as people like Neil Armstrong or Buzz Aldrin. And finally, as the next speaker of our team will highlight as well later, people from indigenous or non-Western cultures have scientific processes as well, but are underrepresented and neglected. So in short, because my time's almost up, dear audience, our team's aim for tonight is to show you why it is that knowledge is political. Just like a law is political due to its legislative process being political, so science is political for scientific knowledge, scientific endeavor is political. The process is political. Because when scientists are silenced, scientific institutions show their hunger for power, and marginalized people seem to be left out of scientific endeavor, knowledge is clearly political. Thank you.
Thank you, Wally. Wally will now be cross-examined by the team against this proposition, and I think specifically by Ansgard Heinrich.
Thank you very much. Okay, I hope my voice is going to do this. Well, thank you very much for your outlines, talking about scientific knowledge as deeply ingrained by bias and competing interests. I find that an intriguing argument, but the one thing I wonder about is you talk about the institutions and you talk about the powers that run these institutions. But I wonder if you're really talking about knowledge as such, knowledge per se, as knowledge, something that is maybe also something that you can separate from the institutions as such. What we would like to further also hear is an example of, for instance, a political step in gathering evidence and how that actually works in your view. And if this gathering of evidence is actually something that can also be seen as objective, or if there's methods that can be identified that have an objective character, which would then maybe contrast your argument of talking about these struggles over knowledge and struggles over who wins the scientific knowledge battle, and that idea that all of this is increasingly, or that is deeply political. And with reference to your talk about Rosalind Franklin, did she actually produce knowledge? That is also something that we would like to hear, because what was the knowledge that was produced, if it was produced, besides the struggle around her gender, around her position within the university?
Let's give Wally a chance to answer.
Yes, thank you. So there are three elements to your point, and this is 3 minutes, so I have to reply rather briefly. The first one is the separation of institutions from knowledge. So perhaps it's possible to have knowledge an sich, so in itself, separate from institutions. We're not convinced of that, or at least I am not. There's no such thing as isolated knowledge or knowledge within a vacuum. These institutions determine what kinds of research is produced, they determine where the funding goes, within this university as well. So I'm not entirely convinced of the point you're making there. The second point was about gathering evidence. Well, gathering evidence seems like a prime example of our point. Because, well, I mean, what evidence are you gathering? Particularly if you look at the social sciences, but also for medical and natural sciences. Depending on the kind of evidence that you collect, and depending on the kinds of knowledge, or sorry, the kind of pre-existing literature you choose, you can have different kinds of conclusions. So evidence gathering is in itself heavily influenced by biases and by interest that you have in certain conclusions. And then thirdly, you have the point about Rosalind Franklin producing actual knowledge. I have to admit, I'm not a chemist, so I don't know what exactly she did. Whether she produced knowledge, well, if she produced justified true beliefs, then that was knowledge. That's our definition. I don't know enough about Rosalind Franklin herself. What I do know is the fact that she was overshadowed by her male colleagues, the fact that conclusions that she drew back in her day took a very long time to be accepted as knowledge by the scientific community is at least a sign or of our point of these biases. My time's up.
Thank you for this, and may I gently remind everybody that cross-examination being only 3 minutes would merit from slightly shorter questions next time, please. So I invite Leah Henderson to open for the team against the proposition that knowledge is political.
We know that we are in Groningen. I know that I'm taking part in this debate. We know that there was snow on the ground this morning. According to our agreed definition, something is political when it's determined by struggles between groups of people. Politics is to do with power struggles. But there doesn't seem to be too much of that in these ordinary cases. Where is the politics in saying that I know there was snow on the ground in the morning? If I say I know I am enjoying this debate, are we going to have a power struggle about that? It looks like as though there are lots of cases, actually, where knowledge appears completely unpolitical. We've also agreed for the purposes of this debate on a definition of knowledge as justified true belief. We admit that there can be political struggle over what to believe or what is justified. But knowledge also involves truth. And this is not a matter for political contestation. Rather, whether something is true or false depends on what's the case in the world. So let's take an example. You might contest that COVID vaccines are effective and try to convince people to believe certain things about them in a political argument. But you only know that they're effective if you have really good grounds for thinking that it's actually true that they are. And this is a matter of whether people actually get sick more when they are vaccinated as opposed to when they are not. Is there global warming? And is it caused by human activities? These questions have become highly politicized. You can believe what you like, but you only know that global warming is happening if you have really good grounds for thinking that it's actually taking place. You can only know that it's caused by emissions of greenhouse gases if you have really good evidence for thinking that it is actually caused by that. And the evidence for thinking that is based on countless observations and measurements. Not only measurements taken with thermometers, but also measurements taken by microwave devices in weather balloons, satellite readings, chemical analysis of ice cores, tree rings, pollen grains. All of this tries to get at the facts which support the hypotheses in question. These facts are not up to us. We can have different opinions about them and arguments about them, but ultimately, how much of a particular isotope there is in a particular level of an ice core sample is not something which we determine by a political struggle. It is important not to regard knowledge as political because that has dangerous consequences. Everything then becomes a matter of power or who shouts loudest. But there are facts out there which are important for our success in the world. And we recognize this by distinguishing between things that we merely believe and things which we know. If we give up on this, there is not much to prevent us winding up in a dystopia like that described in George Orwell's novel, 1984. Orwell has a character, Winston, who works for the Ministry of Truth, responsible for constantly rewriting the historical record to conform to the latest version of what the party wants to count as true. But he knows, as everyone else does, that it isn't really true. In this world, there are thought police who determine what can be thought and not thought. There are wars in this world between different countries or continents. Oceania is at war with Eurasia, but actually, what actually happens in terms of battles, who fights whom, is all erased in terms of an official record which is convenient to the party at the time. This is what happens in a world where knowledge is regarded as political. If what we know is nothing more than the outcome of a political struggle, then we lose any sense of the basic facts. Everything is just an opinion and can be manipulated by those in power. This is not a world that our team wants to live in. So we say that knowledge is not political. It is not simply a matter to be determined by struggles between groups of people. Rather, central to our concept of knowledge is the idea of truth. The truth is not a matter for political contestation. It is determined by things how they actually are. There are lots of straightforward cases where our knowledge apparently has nothing to do with politics. We know that we are now in the aula of the University of Groningen. These are basic facts that our knowledge is based on. And when we strive to get knowledge, these facts are what we need to pay attention to. If we give up on a concept of knowledge which takes account of this, as our opponents would like to convince us, we will find ourselves without proper ways to sort facts from mere opinions and to combat the misinformation and disinformation we are surrounded by.
Thank you, Leah. Mohammed Garisifard has the opportunity to cross-examine Leah now.
Thank you very much, Leah. I listened closely, and there are multiple questions that I could ask, but I will stay short and to the point with two main questions. So the first one is about the case that you painted about the city of Groningen. We are here, we see the snow, and you mentioned that this is a fact. I would argue that for a person sitting here with an eyesight and with certain abilities to go out of the door, the snow is visible, but for others with problems in eyesight, problems of walking out of the door, they're living in Groningen, but they don't see this. So how do you respond to that? Is it the truth for them? Are they included in this truth that you're painting, or it's a different reality for them, in their minds at least? You mentioned the case of global warming and the data, or the fact that, the temperatures are rising. Scientists have been struggling, also my colleagues from the field of water management, for quite some time to convince authorities with facts, with numbers, that basically, this is happening, but the political context and the contested basically power struggles didn't allow for acceptance of this or portraying this in the media. So how can we say that these are facts and these are facts that are true? Thank you.
Okay, so in the case of the city of Groningen and the snow, it is true that not everybody can always get knowledge. Knowledge is based on evidence. In order to have knowledge, you have to get justification. If for some reason you have limitations on your ability to gather evidence, then yes, indeed, you might not come to know that particular fact. But that doesn't mean that somebody who does get the evidence and get good support for that belief doesn't know the point. The second question was to do with global warming, and the question, I'm not entirely sure I understood exactly what the question was, but what was the question? Could you just just repeat?
Yeah. So, if I'm not mistaken, in your talk you mentioned that we know that global warming is happening by numbers, by facts, by certain methods of gathering information. And my question was that why we haven't acted on this knowledge that we have for so long. So for decades we know that temperatures are going up according to numbers. But why haven't we done something about this? So the science or the facts that you talk about, why haven't they been taken seriously or into account?
Yeah, so I think there's quite a story to why we haven't acted, which involves political things, I suppose you would say, right? But this, it involves things like the power that the fossil fuel companies have. It involves things like the disinformation that they put out to frame the issues. It involves the fact that they've tried to mislead the public for a long time about climate science. But I don't see that any of that is particularly relevant to the question of what knowledge in this case is. What I was saying was, if you have knowledge that global warming is occurring, then it's based on huge amounts of scientific evidence. And the fact that we do or don't put the knowledge that we have to use is a separate question, I think. That doesn't bear on the question of what knowledge actually is.
All right, let's leave it at that for this stage, and we will no doubt continue this discussion in slightly later stages. So for the team in favor of the proposition, Carmen Verbruggen is taking over.
Test. Okay. So, our first speech focused on the political embedment of knowledge. Knowledge does not exist within a vacuum, but in the political reality that shapes it. Now we'd like to zoom in more. We already heard some questions to do that. Zoom in more and try to see if we can see knowledge itself within and connected to that web of political struggles, of course. We see language, we see numbers, we see ideas, experiments, methods. Those are the tools we have to justify our beliefs. And those tools itself are political as well. In this argument, I focus on three things. I focus first on words we use. I focus second on how we count. And third, on who participates. Okay, what do we choose? In an earlier job, my task was to design an art history course. It confronted me with many political choices. Which artist should I include and who should I leave out? Could I overcome the male and Western bias of my own education and show an interesting geographical spread? And what about that word Western that splits the world up in two seemingly contrasting parts? Is the use of that word not partly re-establishing that split? So, and which art form should I discuss? Should I go for the usual suspects, oil painting and opera, hobbies of the elite? Or should there be room for folk dances, embroidery, and perhaps karbitschieten? A firework tradition on the countryside that's considered culture by some of our political parties. I told you, it's politics. So these considerations taught me that the choice of a curriculum is always a political choice, and that choosing and framing certain topics has political consequences. Whose culture is respected? Second, how we count. You might say, well, this is the case for the humanities, but what about numbers, statistics, real methods? So 100 people suffering from stress are 100 people suffering from stress. Our response is, how is stress defined? How is it measured? What are the characteristics of the test population? Their gender, their bodies, their organs. We all have different organs. Their age, life history, the moment the survey is conducted, choices in concepts, definitions, research design, test population might cause the number of 100 to go up or down. There are always choices behind the numbers. Choices to fix certain definitions, diseases, psychological disorders, those choices advantage some patients who receive treatment for the things they suffered from, or they might benefit big pharma, and they might disadvantage other patients who just fall outside of the definition, don't receive treatment, or people who feel marginalized by the definition, or people who cannot pay for the high cost, etc. There are interests at stake by making definitions. Third point, who participates? Speaking about the people involved in research as research subjects, what is their say in the outcomes? Done? Oh, almost. Yeah, okay, sorry. Does the research understand the respondent's life better than the respondent him or herself? When researchers express the life of others in numbers, theories, and models, they are placing scientific knowledge hierarchically above the language of their research subjects. They might have good reasons to do so, but definitely power is involved. Researchers working with participatory methods are very much aware of this and search for a less hierarchical pattern. Clearly a political act to take into account the interest of the research communities themselves. Whether this works depends on many things. A usual problem is that the researcher affiliated to a research institute might be attributed a certain status independently of the method he or she works with. So there is usually always this political situation again. Well, in sum, language, numbers, participation in research should all be considered political. Only when we acknowledge that, we can anticipate and account for the societal consequences of our research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carmen. Leah has a chance to cross-examine now.
Okay, so you talked about the choice of a curriculum being political, but does that mean the knowledge within that curriculum is also political just because of that choice? I mean, if that knowledge was come to by means of evidence, as we've suggested, it's well justified, so forth. Yes, it exists within a chosen curriculum, but is it itself political? Secondly, you give the example when it comes to numbers of stress. Now, it's true, there can be certain concepts, especially in social sciences, like stress, where you can discuss how exactly to measure it. But the point about science is that it tries to get a sort of definition in place of how you measure something like that, and then conditional on that definition, it just simply counts. Not only that, but what about cases where we're not dealing with some sort of social aspect? What if we're interested in the number of birds who live in a particular region? Why can't we just count that? What is political about that? And there are lots of cases in science like that, especially in the natural sciences. What about logic? And finally, on the question of who participates, you said power is involved, but is it always involved? I mean, in these cases that we're talking about, from biology, physics, we're not always talking about surveys where we have to include certain people. What about those cases?
Okay, thank you very much. Let me start with the last thing you addressed. What about, these other sciences, biology, logics, maybe mathematics? There might be sciences that have that look as if they do not have a clear political connotation, right? But they certainly might be of use in a certain context and create a political situation. Think about, the stock market and optimizing the stock market with certain calculations. You might say, well, the calculations itself are not political, but then the question is, why do you actually spend money and time to develop certain calculations? Well, perhaps you do that because people believe interests are involved, either economic interest or interest of, ideas of progress of society. So even in these, maybe fundamental forms of research that have the impression of being non-political, a lot of political interest can be at stake. Some other things you said, well, the choice of the curriculum, but what about the knowledge itself? Well, imagine I choose a certain artist, Andy Warhol, and I discuss him as one of the main artists of the 20th century, what a lot of people do. The focus is again on the United States, the focus is again on a man, the focus is on a certain way of thinking. So you highlight some ideas, some people, some continents, and disclose actually other possibilities. So I would say, yes, the knowledge itself is clearly political and is also a tool for further research and education. Okay.
Thank you for this exchange.
Yeah, very short.
We continue with Thomas Filsford, who will give the second talk for the team against this proposition.
Yes, hi. So I will talk about science in a bit of a different way, because to me, science is actually a method to get to knowledge that's ultimately not political. So we just heard the other team talking a little bit about science as a way to produce knowledge. But to me, science is a way to actually discover knowledge, to discover things that are true about the world. We use the scientific method for that, right? You're all familiar with that. We formulate an hypothesis, we test a testable hypothesis, we gather data, we do careful observations, and using that we can actually get an answer to the question and figure out how things actually are in the world. We use logic for that. We use deductive reasoning to make sure our arguments are coherent and structured. And to see how that works, I would like to give a very famous example, the one of Copernicus, who discovered that the sun is actually the center of the universe and not the Earth. So what he did is just was looking at the sky, and he carefully observed how the planets moved across the sky. And based on that, he made some observations, some things that are a bit strange and he couldn't really explain based on the data. And he came up with a much simpler explanation, which was that actually the sun is the center of the universe and not the Earth. And clearly, this was a very controversial statement at the time, right? People were highly against this, and this was contradicting all kinds of political opinions there, from other scientists, it was also religion. And yet he knew that the Earth was not the center of the universe. So this was a justified true belief. He believed that this happened. It was justified because he did some careful observations about this. He made calculations, and everything seemed to check out. The sun had to be the center of the universe, and it was true. We now know that he was right. So this is a very clear example, actually, where it's true that knowledge is ultimately not political, but an objective fact. And so I do think it's very important, actually, to differentiate between the process of doing science and the knowledge that we're trying to discover. And I will be amongst the first to admit that actually the process of science can be political, right? The way in which we get our funding, which questions we decide to pursue, maybe even deciding not to publish results of our research if we have reasons to do so. For example, Copernicus, right? He maybe couldn't immediately publish his results because he would be threatened to many bad things to happen to him, right? Because of his controversial ideas. But still, the knowledge remained the same. The underlying knowledge remained everything that was there. So by employing this, basically the scientific method, we aim to understand the world how it is. And there's many examples of that. So take, for example, the COVID-19 research or medical research that we talked about. The ultimate goal there is to find the most effective kind of medicines for a specific disease. What's the best vaccine that we can make for COVID-19 with the least amount of side effects, for example? Take climate change research, right, where it's really important that we can measure now how much the Earth temperature is rising, how much the sea level is rising, and we can use this information to actually predict what is going to happen in the future, so that we can know how to protect our houses, how to protect nature, how to devise all kinds of techniques to predict what's going to happen, and we can do this in all kinds of terrains. Take, for example, genetics research, where there now is a massive project going on, the Human Genome Database, where there's hundreds or billions of entries of genes and their functions and their structures, all written in there. This is a collaboration between researchers from all over the world, hundreds of researchers who have all contributed to this. And the contents of this database is not political. In fact, I would say it has nothing to do with politics. It's just an objective list of genes that have functions that come to, for example, what genes come to expression in what kind of disorders, diseases, what genes do we have, how are they structured, what's their function. So these are all examples of, I would say, pretty important things that we need to hold on to and that are objectively true and that we can discover using the scientific method. And I could give a bunch more examples, but my time is almost up, so I will keep it to that. But I think my point is clear. We can use the scientific method to actually try to discover how the world is working, how it revolves around us. And using that, we can use it in our advantage, right? This is really important. We can travel to the moon using this. We can build houses, construct bridges. We can improve education. We can do many, many things. And this is only because we use the scientific method to actually discover how the world is working. And I would say we need to protect that, and we need to be very careful to not see everything as knowledge. Yeah.
Thank you, Thomas. And Wally has an opportunity to cross-examine.
Yes, thank you for your speech. I have two questions about what you said. First of all, you have the example of Copernicus and his discovery, as you say, that the Earth revolves around the sun instead of the opposite way. Of course, the Catholic Church had a different way of looking at astronomical bodies, but so do other kinds of people and other kinds of methods, indigenous methods, but the Greeks and the Aztecs and the Byzantines. And so it seems that this is evidence of something being political, because when we define knowledge as justified true belief, then the method we use, it refers to the justification part. So if the method we use heavily depends on interests, on local facts, on people, and the kinds of people who do research, isn't that therefore intrinsically political? The same goes, for example, for the COVID-19 pandemic. How do you know that we've used the best method? This seems to depend on political interests. And the second question I have relates to the Human Genome Project you mentioned. Well, the Human Genome Project was incredible when it comes to fundamental science, fundamental biology. But the choice of which genes to investigate, even though this project was about all genes, the choice to investigate particular genes, which is very expensive, does not just depend on scientific inquiry, but also seems to depend on political interests, because you need money to do your research. So how do you square these two things? On the one hand, saying, well, that the Human Genome Project is a clear example of why it's not political, but that it still seems as if whether to investigate gene A or B is political.
So I think we're still talking about two different things, right? You're talking about the process of doing science, and we're talking about the actual discovery of knowledge that is there, that is a layer deeper, that's always there, independent of whether or not we discover it. So in the example of the Human Genome Project that you mentioned, it may be true that it's not complete and that the selection of genes that we want to investigate is basically partial, right? Or determined by politics. But the list of items that are there, those describe objective knowledge. And it may not be complete, it may be investigated from a highly biased angle, but the things that we do discover using the scientific method are objectively true, and that's what we call knowledge. In the beginning you mentioned that different cultures have evidence for different kind of solar systems, right? They have different, what you call justifications, so you call that knowledge, but that's not true, right? That's the important part of our definition. The only true observation that we have now is that actually the planets revolve around the sun. That's true, and that's why that is knowledge, and the other theories are not.
Right on time as well for this cross-examination. Thank you both. We are entering the final stage of this formal part of this debate, which is the closing statements, and we begin with the closing statement of the team in favor of the proposition, and that is being given by Mohammed Garesifard.
So, thank you very much. Thank you to my teammates, making my life very easy here. So, dear audience, I would like to start concluding this part of the debate with emphasizing that knowledge is undoubtedly political. Societies construct their own truths, influenced by power dynamics and contested values. This shapes our understanding of our living environment, often highlighting certain perspectives and marginalizing others. Throughout our discussion, we've explored various facets of this proposition, examining the political nature embedded in the very fabric of what we consider knowledge. We highlighted the political dimensions in scientific research, where funding research topics, data interpretations, and dissemination of findings are inevitably influenced by biases, power dynamics, and competing interests. The recent struggle during the COVID-19 pandemic vividly demonstrates how the winners in this struggle basically pick and choose how to portray truth and what vaccines to be produced and perhaps distributed. Scientific endeavors, as objective as they may strive to be, are subject to manipulation, for example, through political interests. It is therefore naive to assume that science is objective. Scientists, as gatekeepers of knowledge, are not only influenced by political pressure, but also play an active role in portraying what knowledge means to the society. The example of misconduct, for example, by the Saudi Arabian universities just shows the length in which institutions may go to basically mainstream their own strategic ideologies. Building on this foundation, we delved a little bit deeper into the tools that are used to justify our beliefs. We talked about language, numbers, ideas, experiments, and observations. The political choices in designing a curriculum, for example, defining concepts and conducting research are all integral part of the knowledge production process, and these are not detached from the knowledge itself. The words we choose, how we count, and who participates in the research process are therefore not neutral. Education, that's the cornerstone of societal knowledge dissemination, is deeply political. Curriculum choices and the knowledge that is deemed essential reflects basically societal values and power structures. In addition, we talked about public participation in knowledge production that is facing extreme resistance from scientists and gatekeepers of science in academia, resulting in often dismissed values of local and indigenous knowledge. Public participation is not just about access, it's about recognizing diverse perspectives. Sadly, traditionally, knowledge systems developed over generations are often sidelined, including introducing cultural biases and neglecting values of other people. Let's take the example of sustainable agriculture, for example. Such sustainable agricultural practices have had roots in indigenous knowledge for generations. But often these practices are portrayed as wasteful, not efficient, or backwards, because certain approaches that are perhaps for profit are favorable to be promoted. The reality, however, is that we know that certain indigenous ways of doing agriculture are far more environmental friendly than the so-called advanced agricultural knowledge. The execution of diverse voices in decision-making processes therefore can lead to policies that deepen societal divides and fail to address the needs of all citizens. After all, our arguments, basically you might fear that science loses its status as a provider of the purest form of truth. But as we showed, this fear exactly implies that science needs to be defended because interests are at stake. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohammed. And the closing remarks from the team against this proposition will be given by Ansgard Heinrich.
Thank you. Knowledge is political. We oppose. To wrap up our main argument, we instead argue that the very concept of knowledge is not political. Politics joins the debate the moment people interact, for instance, with knowledge. Or in other words, how knowledge is interpreted might be political. The very essence of knowledge is not. So the use of knowledge is a different thing than knowledge itself. From where we stand, knowledge can be broken down to bare facts. This is sometimes as easy as attesting that we know when a person has high fever, that this person is sick. Yes, yet it takes the evidence in the form of testing for certain diseases that helps us identify and thus know what disease a person suffers from. This evidence-based testing, which draws on scientific methods, is an exercise that helps us gain knowledge, and it is an exercise that strives for epistemic objectivity. As Thomas outlined previously, scientific disciplines are a prime example here. As scientists, we collect evidence to create knowledge, to create justified true beliefs. Let this be clear then, we need to distinguish between belief that can very well be political and objective knowledge that is justified true belief. And that search for objective knowledge does also take place outside of the halls of academia. We now live in a media-saturated world and time and age where we need to climb the highest mountain to escape from floods of information, reaching us via media devices from radio to television, and even on top of that mountain, our phone might ring. A good deal of those pictures, videos, text snippets that flow via these various channels of digital communication routes we can access today that is mis or disinformation. It is stated beliefs that might be political, that dress up as knowledge, that can be straight out lies, and they are sold on grounds of unfounded claims that mask themselves as true knowledge. Yet, they are bare of evidence and thus boil down to nothing more than a belief. Examples are multiple here, from disinformation about the COVID-19 pandemic to troll farms spreading disinformation on contemporary conflicts and war, all with the aim of hijacking masses of people to believe. The one weapon we have to fight these armies of mis and disinformants are instruments that scientists also use in their research: logic and reasoning. These are key in exposing disinformation. It is empirical evidence that enables those fighting these armies of these armies to deconstruct false claims, to draw the curtain on disinformation, and to lead us to true knowledge. The fundament of any fact-checking operation that aims to counter disinformation nowadays, that is floating through online media spheres, that fundament is to fight back on grounds of the use of justified true belief. From testing results to delivering sound evidence, from verifying claims to checking for accuracy. Across social media platforms, we now witness how traditional news organizations, from the BBC to the NOS, as well as dedicated fact-checking enterprises, rise to demask disinformation. And they aim to get past political claims and use evidence in their work. In fact, these fact-checkers would be siding with us here today, as their work revolves around that proposition that the very concept of knowledge is not political. These fact-checkers fight the good fight by aiming to separate true knowledge, justified true belief, from just belief. Coming to a close, we want to pose one final question. What is to lose when we give in to the proposition that knowledge is political? Hypothetically speaking, we might end up in this Orwellian scenario that my team member already sketched. For researchers, we as scientists might then have to relive what Copernicus went through. As Thomas pointed out earlier, for him, publishing research results was very dangerous. Yet, given what we now witness by the minute, turning on X or Facebook or Instagram, we might not even have to look too far to see what happens when that belief that knowledge is political makes its rounds. Here it is where we as scientists actually have a job to do. We need to keep on attempting to uncover objective knowledge that is somewhere down there in that layer. And just as important, we need to keep on teaching our students the skills, these processes of doing research that we described earlier, so that they are equipped to walk out into this world and know the tools that are needed to move beyond mere beliefs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's thank our speakers for their contributions. Okay, so with this, the formal debate is over. We now have the chance to have a more relaxed discussion. And if anybody has questions or comments, we have Nina going around with the microphone, so just raise your hand, please. And if your question is addressed to one of the teams or to a speaker in particular, please let us know whom you would like to address it to.
This is for everyone. Maybe I've missed a memo, but I feel like in the discussion of knowledge and politics, in the definition of knowledge, there was always this almost wave away of what it means to be true. And I'm curious to know exactly how you define what true is without escaping this feeling of, oh, we just call that as true. And then I ask the question of who defines what is true? And this is a question for everyone. I don't know who wants to answer the question.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. We actually had a little discussion over that during dinner, falafel dinner. So our ideas about that were that truth actually exists within an episteme of knowledge. So to certain epistemes of knowledge, certain domains of knowledge, the concept of truth might be very important. And to other domains, it might be less important. It might even depend on the case. So I think sorry, I have the names ready. No, okay. So the last example of COVID, I think a lot of importance is placed on the notion of truth. Who has the truth, right? And then it's, I think we had an example in our politics of a minister who really wanted to have certain numbers expressed, numbers about patients at the intensive care and the percentage of people not being vaccinated. And then it appeared that in the metadata, so it appeared that some definitions that they made for measuring this number was that actually the people of who they did not have any knowledge of being vaccinated or not were counting it as not being vaccinated. So it was a bit slippy, the research. But I think truth is here. The truth is here claimed to be like simplified. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. I think the first thing was what we wanted to say, that it is created within an episteme of knowledge. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, so I think we have maybe a more straightforward answer to this question. So we think truth is something to do with what's the case in the world. And we're not going to be able to give you a complete philosophical theory of truth because it's a very sort of complicated topic. But sort of simply speaking, the glass is on the table is true just when the glass is on the table. There's snow on the ground outside just when that's true, just when there is snow on the ground outside. That's what we mean by truth. That seems quite natural, right? But that means that nobody owns it. It's not a matter of who has the truth. The truth is out there. So at least, yeah. So that's how I think that's how we all think of it, right? Yeah.
We could also continue this conversation about what is truth, because this seems to be the central issue that the two teams discussed in one way or another. So if anybody from the audience has thoughts on this, or maybe they could point out how the two teams disagree or contribute to this in any other way, this is also possible. Otherwise, other questions are also welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for a very nice exchange of ideas and arguments. I was wondering if the proposition had been science is political, would that have made a difference if you see science as the process that leads to knowledge? Would the parties then agree that they don't disagree? I was looking. I saw the movie Oppenheimer, and we thought about it to play it for nothing but the truth. So there's the Nazis who are building the bomb, and then the Americans put a lot of scientists into a desert because they want to discover it first. So there is an objective truth, but there is the process of finding it, which is accelerated by political means. And you can look, you can use that also for climate research. In Brazil, under Bolsonaro, nobody was doing climate research, even though if you want to see the facts, they are out there. So, of course, there's also in the Netherlands all kinds of examples. So would that make you friends forever, or are there still discrepancies?
Any of the teams?
Yeah. I mean, a large part of our argument relied on the idea that the scientific process is political. So I'm really curious as to what our opposition has to say to this. So I'm really just throwing it over the fence there and saying, well, would you then agree with us?
I think we actually would, yeah. I think it would be pretty difficult to disagree with the fact that the process of doing science is not a political endeavor, right? Many examples that you actually mentioned, but there's many processes being influenced by how we do science. So the way in which we get funding for specific research projects, right, is very much determined by the time we live in. The topics that are important to investigate now, that's basically determined by politics or by the people we talk to or by processes amongst people. Also deciding like which research questions to pursue as an individual, or deciding whether or not to, yeah, like I mentioned, to publish the results of your research. This is all going to determine what knowledge is going to be out there, is going to be sort of brought to the public by scientists, but it says nothing about the knowledge that's one layer deeper, that's always there, whether or not it's discovered or not. Yeah.
I think you also started to answer the question yourself a wee bit, because you were sort of distinguishing between science as a process and then some sort of idea of a scientific method which is aiming to get at the knowledge. And so I think, yeah, like Thomas says, we would concede that if we mean science as the overall process, then we wouldn't have argued for it being unpolitical. But if we do mean that method, then I think we would maybe stick to our line of argument.
Can I maybe quickly respond? Because I think still the thing that would divide us is that we don't believe in the possible separation of knowledge and the embedment of knowledge. They are always interconnected. That's why I started about the metadata. Make a scientific claim, but you always have to tell how you did it, what you made, because it never gives the full picture. It's always an angle, a constructed angle. So I still think like the returning claim has been, oh, but look at knowledge itself. We agree, right? The embedment is political, but knowledge itself, and we say knowledge itself does not exist. It's always embedded, always. Like even the water example.
Even the water example? Just so there is, we might have, I mean,
Yeah.
I agree with you, we might have a word for it, like we might actually say this is a glass. Maybe other languages have a different word for it. It's about science, etc. But still, we all agree, it's right in front of me. It's there.
But framing that is drawing importance to something being there on the table. It's a certain framing of reality that we choose for and say, well, this is important, we know this. But why is it important to know that the glass is on the table, the glass is there, attracting my attention?
We didn't say it was important, we just said we knew it. We didn't say it was important.
But before you said it, I think the attention of the room was not drawn towards this glass, right? So it's a kind of act to draw attention to a detail of the complex reality here, and then prioritizing that detail as something that is knowledge. So that is a kind of political implicit thing of knowledge. You highlight something and you say, well, that is something important, we all see it. And so on. So I think, I mean, you can go very far with this.
Yeah, but I mean, the highlighting, yeah, and where you put the emphasis, there is where interpretation might come in. But still, the glass is there.
So can we say the disagreement is about realism and social constructivism, as in there is a reality out there to be known?
Part of it is, yeah, I think so. I mean, so we use language when we make claims about the world, we agree with that. If we use different languages, then we have different ways of framing what we say. But that doesn't mean that we somehow like create the world by using language. The world is there, we describe it using language.
Yeah, just coming quickly here. So I think this construct of reality is something that is still political, and within academia we have the scientific process, something that is accepted within the doors of academia, and we define things like that. So I go back to my own field of expertise. So once I went to a local area, there was a flooding, and we wanted to model basically to understand better next time that flood comes, where does the water stops? So how much water is there? And there was a local person pointed to a tree and said, okay, the water was this high. So it's like 5 meters above the ground, let's assume, so the water stands there. That perception is, if I look at it as a scientist, this is invalid, this is not useful. I need to go to my model, I need to have the speed of the water, I need to have the cross-section of the river, and I need to come to this conclusion by myself, because this is the way that I've learned how to practice hydrology or how to calculate for water. But that person doesn't know this method, and still something that he says is valid and it's true. But for me, it's very easy to disregard it because I don't understand it. The water is the water, so the water is just standing there still.
Thank you, Mohammed. More questions? There's one in the back.
Thanks for the very interesting debate, and I've also particularly liked the way that the opposition said that the truth can just exist out there, that it's just the snow that we see over there, that it exists in a vacuum, in a way contradicting what was said in the opening. And I kind of agree with that the truth can exist in the vacuum, but then my question is, how are we able to access that truth? And that, like, accessing of truth implies observation, and my question would be, can observation be apolitical in this case?
I think that's an excellent question, and my answer would be that it is very difficult. We do agree that there can be an absolute truth out there in the world, but as soon as we start interacting with it, as soon as we start studying it, we always have a perspective, right? Like what you mentioned, you have a way of measuring the water, others have another way of talking about or thinking about the water. It might have been at a certain level, but in some cases there just isn't something like a universal observer or someone who has the overview of the situation. So as soon as you start studying things, it's difficult, but this is something that we should strive to do using science, right? Using a scientific method, we can come up with ways that are as objective as possible, and I think we should try to stick to that.
And what we often do in practice is to try and observe things from different perspectives and then kind of triangulate in order to work out what's actually going on. That's a fairly basic feature of what scientists do.
And maybe adding to this, I think this is also where some of the points that you, like the critical remarks that you made about how science can actually be very much political in the way how it is actually practiced. Taking on board these debates or actually having that critical look could actually in fact help us to strive for a more complete science or to get closer to that objective truth, because you're putting us on our heels a little bit by saying, hey, this is where, for instance, gender debates play a role. This is where we have, this is where there's imbalances. This is where science is actually biased. And by pointing the finger at these issues that we're subjected to as scientists or that universities are subjected to, we can maybe make that scientific world a little better and get more towards that strive towards finding that truth or identifying that knowledge.
All right, so I have a question, because it seems as if there's a secret claim that you're making that I think is very weird, which is about the metaphysics of your argument. So we talk about objective truth. Thank you for your question, by the way. And you say that you agree with us that the process is intrinsically political, and so we're only making approximations. But there is an objective truth out there. That seems rather weird. Like, what kind of entity would that be? It seems like there's no facts flying around, you know? How do we access these? We say through a process that's intrinsically political, meaning we only have approximations, meaning that our knowledge is intrinsically political because you can't get the objective thing, and you seem to admit that. And so, how do you square that? Like, what do you?
We don't mean anything weird though when we say it's the world. I said, you know, if we say we know that there's snow on the ground, if there is snow on the ground, there's nothing weird about that. It's just the fact that there's snow on the ground that is this thing that we need to get at. And then we go and we try and collect evidence. We try and make observations to see whether or not there is snow on the ground. It's not that mysterious.
Do you agree that those observations and the entire process of getting to know, so to say, that there is snow, you say that this is tainted, and then there's an objective truth as to whether there really is snow outside or not, but if this truth is never really accessible to us, and if we can only make approximations because we have to use different perspectives and we always have pragmatic approximations, then it's a weird argument to say that knowledge or objective knowledge still exists. It's a physically like a weird entity.
So are you saying that it's strange that we can gather evidence and try and get at a fact? I mean, I'm not quite grasping what's really that peculiar about that. I mean, that just seems like something we do all the time, every day.
What I feel like is strange is that there's presumably from you, what I hear is that there's from your end an assertion that there is such a thing as objective truth, and that through approximations we can, or absolute truth is something I heard you say, and that through approximations we can get close to that. But if we can never really get to absolute truth, then all the knowledge we have are approximations, and then they are just intrinsically political.
Yeah, we don't have to actually define knowledge in such a way that we can have it only when there's no possibility of being wrong. So I think a more sort of a slightly more relaxed way of talking about knowledge, where you say, well, you know, you have knowledge of something when you have really, really good grounds for it. That's what we mean by knowledge. And you're worried that, we're just maybe not just quite achieving that complete. It doesn't matter, because we're just talking about like getting really, really good grounds for our belief.
Yeah, and I think we can just take a pragmatic stance here, right? If our grounds for beliefs are good enough to make accurate predictions in order to cure the disease or predict earthquakes or whatever, then science is progressing, I would say. Doesn't mean that we always have the absolute truth. No, probably not. But that doesn't need to be very frustrating, I would say.
And we'll take another question from the audience so that we have a bit more people speaking. Yeah.
More truth.
Yeah, okay.
It's
It's quite interesting, because I came to be here via Facebook. So it's quite interesting, because I was always forever asking myself this question about science and politics, and what a great influence politics has on science, and vice versa. My question is, during the COVID period, there was this saga in the American hospitals about pulse oximeters, and it was not really catered for people of a darker skin complexion. And now my question is, I don't know if now I'm doubting myself, but anyway, I don't know whether it's the absolute truth, because I only got it via the media and the democratized Google, where you search everything and you think you know it. So I'm here today to ask, how can we as a people trust the scientific community? Because obviously it also almost got politicized, that issue of the pulse oximeters and the unfair treatment or all this kind of stuff. So my question is, how can we as a people, as a general public, because I'm not an academic and in any way, shape and form, I'm just a simple housewife, so I'm just here to ask these questions. How can we trust science so that science will not be influenced by politics? Can science guide us for better health and prosperity for the future? Is science for everybody? Because that is the question that I'm always asking, because I'm coming across different things. Like the gentleman in the middle, he had about genomics and all these DNA researches and so. And then my question is, like, there's hardly nobody of color here, and also in the academic community as now is not presented or represented. How would I ever get that guarantee that as if something happens in my genomics and as a human, how would I ever get that fair treatment? Because it will be politicized, obviously, because politics plays a role. Because I'm coming from Southern Africa, and apartheid system shaped our education and our way of life. So I know what politics is and what politics can do to knowledge and how politics can classify knowledge. So I'm just curious.
Thank you for this question. Who would like to think along?
I think you're raising super important points here, and it touches a little bit on what I was trying to convey earlier, that so we still are at that idea that knowledge has some justified belief, but what you're saying is pretty much, or I think that the way how I understand it is, science needs to do better when it comes to transparency, and when it comes to inclusion, and when it comes to reaching out to publics. Outreach, we call it on our end, I think. Because science has maybe for way too long taken place behind closed doors. And we have not really reached out much. I think today, for instance, is a great example of outreach, of trying to get into the discussion, of listening to publics, of listening to what your questions are. And the other point that you actually touch upon is what we started discussing here, that science can be very biased and that knowledge can be instrumentalized. And that only when science or researchers start becoming more transparent, when we start actually debating our own culture and critically examining how we do research, how we are funded, and who we actually let participate in our networks, it's only then when we can start moving forward, or that's pretty much what is happening now, at least in some disciplines, or the ones that I know of and that I'm part of, that is how we can actually move forward. But I might want to hand it over. Do you want to add to this, or?
I agree with what you're saying. I mean, I think there are a lot of political decisions in determining what gets studied by science, as you said, like what gets funded so that it actually becomes a topic of scientific research. And unfortunately, topics which are of interest to whole groups of people get omitted from what actually gets studied by science, which is really unfortunate because it means that all the knowledge which is acquired is not serving the interests of some groups. So I think that is something that we have to think quite hard about. But it isn't so much a question for within science. I mean, the things that determine what gets studied in science, this happens sort of more at the level of government, who they decide, how they decide to put the funding systems in place. And we still are hoping to defend the idea that if you do have a well-defined topic of study, then the knowledge that's produced in that area can still be relatively unpolitical. It's the choice of topics. So we want science to actually solve problems for us. But then whose problems, right? These are all about choosing what we actually study in science. So yeah, I think this is really important that you brought this forward.
If I may, excellent questions. I really enjoyed it. It was like you were in our team. Again, reiterating some of the points that we tried to basically compact in these few minutes. But just to add to that, I think one thing that we for sure need to rethink is about the scientific methods, the ways that we understand our living environment. So there are certain methods that we follow, and these are like the way to understand certain realities on the ground by opening up these processes to the public. And there are already fields that are doing very well in that area, including the general public in the scientific research process, from defining the questions that are important to collecting information about that, to analyzing the data. So citizens as partners in the scientific research, I think, is the way to go, and we are already doing that in the field of citizen science for decades now. So opening up that closed doors of academia, I fully agree, to the general public and have them as partners in research helps basically representing what matters to the public and not what we would like to study behind closed doors or behind our computers as scientists.
Thank you. There is another question.
The gentleman had a question first.
Oh, no, rather not. Not really a question, more a rant, I think. I think the proposition makes no sense. I believe nothing is inherently anything. Everything is perception, and objective knowledge isn't perceivable. And even though, from my perspective, every social interaction is political, you can have such perceptions in a vacuum. That's it.
Thank you. Another question in the back, or comment, or rant.
Hello. So I think I have a question for the right team. So what I basically understood is what you presented as a fact or truth was like basic facts, like there was snow this morning on the ground. And I guess my question is, do you consider interpretation also part of the knowledge? Because what you said, like there was snow in the morning, the temperature of the air was, I don't know, 2 degrees. That's like basic data set that is sort of worthless without the interpretation. And you already agreed that the interpretation is where the political struggle ensures. So do you consider interpretation also part of the knowledge, or just the pure data set that you can measure?
So for the purpose of the current discussion, we explicitly decided to leave interpretation out of knowledge, right? So knowledge are only the things that are truly there, objectively there, that are out there in the world. And you're absolutely right that that's worthless without interpretation. But that means that as soon as you start interacting with the knowledge, it starts becoming political. And there's no way to do this objectively. So just because we, for this debate, define knowledge as a justified true belief, we decided not to, explicitly not to talk about interpretation there.
Yeah, I also think, though, that some things are more interpretation than others, right? And so I think that there can be cases where the role of interpretation is more minimal, and also that in the sense that, the possibility to have different interpretations is more minimal, is what I mean. And yeah, so I think this is part of the sort of general thought that we had, which is to try to say that, well, the way you use knowledge is really different from what the knowledge itself is. And we do lots of things with the knowledge that we have. We construct stories, we construct narratives, we construct interpretations. We do all that stuff with knowledge. But the knowledge is the basis that we use to construct all those interpretations, and it's also the basis that we use to judge them and compare them with each other and try and decide between them.
Carmen, did you have something?
If I may, I wanted to quickly return to one of the concerns that is, I think, a concern of us all, the trustworthiness of science. And I think this debate, that it might be interesting to wonder whether it would be more useful for the trustworthiness of science to kind of keep pointing at that truth independently of us, or to acknowledge all of these political things that are necessary at stake when we do research. We always make choices. So to claim that this is the truth and the final truth, is it actually helpful for science to be trusted, or should we actually highlight more the political reality of science, also not to give this false image of science as the world out there that exists independently of us. I mean, we live in an age where almost every part of the world is dependent on human behavior. The whole climate has changed because of it. So this embeddedness of us, these political concerns, especially in the climate debate. Why do we want to count birds? Because we care for the birds, because we want to define the birds in a certain way. So really to acknowledge the political struggle and the political interest might actually help research to be more trustworthy. That was something I wanted to also respond to the earlier comments, but I'm curious.
Yeah, I think it's important that, we don't want our position to come across as if, science is the ultimate truth that's out there, and it can never, any scientific claim can never be wrong. So we don't want to say that. We just wanted to say that knowledge is not entirely just a matter of struggling interests. It's not just entirely a matter of politics. There is this sort of, if you like, external element to it. We can be wrong about it for sure. So there needs to be a certain humility about science. And often the expectation that science is going to be completely infallible does breed a kind of distrust of science when it's disappointed. So it's really true, we don't want to have that kind of point of view.
Just reflections. And I think we had questions from Heng or from Robert, I'm not sure, in the front. No? Yeah?
I loved your snow example because it's so simple. But the truth is that scientific questions usually address complex issues. So when do you stop searching? We have a reproduction crisis, so people expect meat eaters to be more aggressive, and then they find it in their data. Or the serotonin hypothesis in depression suits the pharmaceutical industry very well, so we stick with that for 50 years, even though if you dive deeper, it becomes more complex. And that's almost with any scientific issue. So your snow example sort of reduces the whole layer of depth of questions and truths that is out there once you keep on exploring. And I think, as has been said, that is where the politics is also. And so, but for the sake of the argument, it was very well done.
I mean, we want to say that we want to say kind of both, right? That indeed, like a lot of the issues that you deal with in science are complex, and they have to build up a theory that connects a whole lot of different facts about the world. But the thing not to lose sight of is that there are basic facts like there's snow on the ground, or there is this much of the isotope in this sample, at the basis of science as well. So if we go in the direction of saying, well, it's all political, I think we lose sight of the fact that there are these basic facts also in the foundation of science.
I think we'll try to wrap up the discussion as it's getting quite late and the building is closing. But I think a lot of us will feel similarly to myself that this is a topic that we could just keep exploring and exploring. And to end, I think we'll just share a few thoughts that we had as hosts from this vantage point. We also met the teams before this event, and we discussed a lot about the terms in this proposition: what is knowledge, what is political. So this is something that has been on our mind for a while. But through the discussions that we had, I started thinking, well, I learned two main things, I think. The first one is that it snowed, and the second one is that we have water glasses, and hopefully that's true for at least the people in the room. But we also thought about it, or it made me reflect a bit on the role of objectivity. We talked about objectivity as a goal in science, as something to strive towards, as this ideal that may not be reachable all the time, but that's something that is something valuable that the scientific method provides us with, or this gradual approaching of the objective ideal. But I also wonder to what extent this objectivity rhetoric is sometimes just that, a rhetoric that functions to obfuscate the ways in which science has been used and has been complicit in all sorts of oppression because of what it means to be objective and because of the power lying in the idea of objectivity itself. And this is where the other team brought a lot of interesting points in about how actually bringing to the fore the subjectivity inherent to science, to scientific processes, can help us see more clearly what happens, and maybe even be more objective if we think about objectivity as understanding all of this nuance that's inherent to knowledge and the dynamics of knowledge in our world. So objectivity is tricky, and I wonder if subjectivity is necessary for more objectivity, and this is kind of the paradox I'm left with after what we talked about. And I wonder if Tassos has more thoughts.
Yeah, I always have more thoughts. I find it very, very funny that the majority of the discussion today revolved around the fact that it snowed and how this is not a political matter. It's an extremely political matter in my household on a Monday morning when my daughter argues that there's too much snow to go to school. As well, the fact that she leaves glasses of water on the table all the time and she denies that she does this. This is also a political matter in our household. So I feel kind of funny on all of these topics. I also feel very uneasy because this is a really difficult conversation that we've been having as scientists in our communities for quite a few years, and I, as a teacher of research methods in particular, for also a number of years. It's very difficult because of all of the things that were mentioned today, that indeed there is this idea, desire even perhaps, if you like, that there is a sort of a fundamental objective nature in reality that we can somehow access. That's okay, I suffer from the same cough, so I very much sympathize, just to demonstrate. And yet, we also talked about how the process of doing science is itself very much obstructed by biases in its methodology, biases in the way that we understand information, in the way that we ask ourselves questions, in the way that we create tools. And these biases can be mundane. They can just lead to, some samples pointing slightly to one side than the other, and they can be extremely dangerous in the way that they exclude very large groups of individuals, as has been mentioned very, very powerfully, and how this is damaging to our society and to these groups of individuals. And yet, I'm always in my teaching, when I talk about the scientific method, you have to be extremely critical, and this is one of the fundamental aspects of the scientific method, that it is very self-critical. And at the end of the day, you still have to you still have to come up with conclusions based on your most reasonable access to some kind of reality, the most reasonable answers to these questions that you have, and that you have to trust them. And part of this trust happens from this extreme willingness to question. And some of this shakiness in the trust comes from this extreme willingness to question and to constantly pose these questions. So it's an extremely difficult matter. I guess my final thought is that I'm really happy that we have more of these discussions today than we did during my PhD years. I know very much that matters like this were in very, very, very small esoteric corners of the scientific community back when I was doing my PhD, and I'm very happy that these are now central in the main halls of our institution, and indeed in the conference that is being organized later this week. I'm grateful to see people engage with these questions, and I hope to see more of you in fora like this, where we can question each other more.
Thank you, Tassos. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah,